The Colorado mountains keep their secrets the way the dead keep theirs. A wagon cuts through the dark at a pace that has nothing to do with the road and everything to do with what is behind it. Wheels crack frozen earth. The old mule does not need to be told to run. He already knows. Inside the wagon, a woman holds a leather notebook against her chest. Not for warmth. Behind them, 5 torches appear on the ridge. Unhurried, silent. The kind of pursuit that does not need to rush, because the people doing the pursuing have already decided how this ends. The mule stops. Ahead, through the falling snow, a cabin. 1 window. 1 thin line of firelight against all that dark. The woman looks back at the torches. Looks forward at the light. She climbs down. Walks to the door. And knocks. The mule stopped first. May Calloway had not pulled the reins. She had not clicked her tongue or shifted her weight on the wagon bench. Solomon simply stopped. 4 hooves planted in the frozen ruts of the mountain trail like he had made a private calculation and arrived at a private conclusion, and now he was done moving until the matter was settled. May looked at the back of his gray ears. Both of them stood straight up. She looked at the trail ahead. Nothing there. Just the dark shape of pine trees closing in on both sides, the last thin light of November draining out of the Colorado sky, like water leaving a shallow pan, and somewhere above the tree line a wind that smelled of iron and coming snow. Nothing to stop a mule. Nothing visible anyway. Solomon knew something she did not. She had learned to trust that. Nora Vale sat beside her, on the bench, her calico skirt pulled tight over her knees against the cold, her dark eyes already moving to the trees on the left side of the trail before May had finished thinking the thought. 19 years old, and she never needed to be told twice. She never needed to be told once. She saw things, and she filed them away, and she waited. And that patience had kept all of them alive through 4 weeks of moving by night and resting by day across the eastern slope of the Rockies. In the wagon bed behind them, Wade Briggs sat with his back against the sideboard, and his long legs folded at awkward angles because he was 20 years old and still growing into his own body, and he had not quite figured out how to fold it properly yet. He wore his hat pulled low against the wind. He had been trying to sleep for the last hour. He was not sleeping. His eyes came open the moment Solomon stopped. Beside him, Iris Doyle sat with her knees drawn up and her wool coat wrapped around her shoulders, the red scarf Nora had knitted from unraveled yarn somewhere in New Mexico territory, looped twice around her neck. 19 years old and small for it, she had the look of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand it was not safe, but had decided, somewhere in the marrow of her bones, to be gentle anyway. She looked at the back of May's head. "He's stopped," Wade said. "I see that. Why has he stopped?" May did not answer because she was looking up the trail at what she had not seen 30 seconds ago. A light, faint and distant and half hidden by a shoulder of dark hill, but unmistakable, orange. Steady. Not a lantern swinging on a hook, but light through a window, which meant walls, which meant a roof, which meant a structure occupied by something other than wind. A cabin. She pressed 2 fingers against her sternum through the wool of her coat and felt her own heartbeat, which was faster than she wanted it to be. They had been moving since before dawn. Lucy, her feet were wrong inside her boots, the left one swollen from where she had twisted her ankle, crossing the creek bed near Alamosa, and had not told May until the limping became impossible to hide. They were out of the hard bread they had been rationing since Pueblo. The water in the barrel had a skim of ice across the top that May had broken with her elbow that morning, and the barrel itself had a slow seep at the seam that meant by tomorrow morning there would be substantially less water than there was tonight. They needed to stop. She had promised herself she would not stop at any structure she had not already studied from 2 vantage points at different times of day. She had promised herself no farmhouses, no way stations, no mountain cabins with smoke from the chimney. Too many ways for that to go wrong. Too many ways for a man with a kind face and a rifle behind the door to recognize a woman from a paper that had been tacked to bulletin boards from Colorado Springs to Santa Fe. Solomon was already walking toward the light. He had not waited for her to decide. He had simply started walking, slow and deliberate, and the wagon moved with him. The because the wagon did not have a choice. And neither May realized, did she? Not really. Not tonight, with the wind coming down off the peaks, and Iris's cough getting worse, and Wade's face going tight every time the wagon hit a frozen rut and jolted the ankle May was not supposed to know about. She let him walk. The cabin sat on a flat shelf of land about halfway up a hill that was not quite a mountain, but was trying to be. The trail wound up toward it through a stand of lodgepole pine that opened unexpectedly into a cleared yard with a fence on 3 sides and a stone well and a structure beside the cabin that was either a barn or a large shed. Hard to tell in this light. A good spring and summer had left the grass long and brown and flattened by early snow. The yard had the look of a place that had once been kept with care and was currently being kept with bare sufficiency. Like a man who still combs his hair in the morning, but has stopped caring whether it lies flat. Solomon stopped at the porch steps. Not because May told him to, because the porch steps were apparently, in Solomon's judgment, the correct place to stop. May sat with the reins in her hands and looked at the cabin door and did not move for almost a full minute. The window showed the fire. Just a fire. No silhouette passing in front of it, no lamp being lifted to peer out at the sound of a wagon, no sign that whoever was inside had heard them arrive. Or, and this was the thought she turned away from quickly, no sign that whoever was inside wanted her to know they had heard. She wrapped the reins around the brake handle. Her boots hit the porch boards, and the boards announced her with a sound like a pistol shot, and she did not flinch because flinching was a luxury she had trained herself out of. She walked to the door, and she knocked. Not frantically, not like someone at the end of something. Deliberately, twice. The kind of knock that said, I have come here on purpose and I expect a civil conversation. Nothing. She waited 4 breaths and knocked again. This time she heard it. Slow footsteps. The specific rhythm of a man who is measuring each step because one of them costs something. And then nothing. Just the particular quality of silence on the other side of a door when a person has stopped directly behind it. Who's there? Not a question. The tone of a man who has decided there are very few acceptable answers and is already skeptical. May, Calloway. She kept her voice level. I have people with me. We don't mean trouble. The silence on the other side of the door had a texture to it now. She could feel him thinking, or deciding whether to decide. She heard the click of a bolt. The door opened 6 inches, not all the way. 6 inches. And in the gap stood a man who looked like the mountains had made him, and then worn him down again over many years of patient effort. He was tall, which she could tell, even from the partial view, with the kind of width in the shoulders that came from actual labor rather than ambition. His flannel shirt was dark green, the collar open, sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold in a way that suggested he had stopped noticing temperature some time ago. A leather vest, worn through at both front pockets. Dark hair going gray at the temples in broad strokes. A beard that had not been tended in a week, maybe more. His eyes were gray, or something close enough to gray that the distinction didn't matter, and they moved across her face, and then past her to the wagon, and then to Nora, beside the wagon to Wang and where Wade had climbed down and was standing with his hands visible, because Wade was smart enough to know what you did with your hands when a strange man looked out at you from a half-open door. His left hand held the door, his right was lower, and she did not look at where it was, because she did not want him to know she had noticed. He said nothing. He looked at all of them with the systematic patience of a man who had spent many years reading situations before speaking into them, and May had the odd sensation that he had already filed away more information about her than most people gathered in an hour of conversation. We need shelter for the night. She made herself maintain eye contact. We have a wagon and a mule. We won't take more space than we need, and we'll be gone before you want breakfast. His eyes went past her again to the wagon bed, where Iris had appeared at the canvas opening, the red scarf bright against the gray of everything else. His expression did not change. She was not sure it could change, but something in the quality of his attention shifted, very slightly, like a scale settling. I don't take in strangers. I understand that. She did not argue the point. She did not tell him that it was cold, or that they were tired, or that she could see he was a decent man who wouldn't turn them away. She had learned that telling people they were decent rarely made them be decent. It usually just made them defensive. I understand that completely. She turned back toward the wagon. Nora was already moving toward the wagon bed, reaching back to help Iris climb down, and Iris stepped out, and her right boot hit the frozen ground at the wrong angle, and her ankle gave and she went down. Not all the way down. She caught herself on the wagon wheel with one hand, and Nora had her arm before she could fall further. But the impact was enough. The wool scarf slipped from her neck, and there it was, visible for a breath or two before Nora pulled her close. The bruising across Iris's collarbone, old enough to have yellowed at the edges, new enough in the center to still be the color of a winter storm. May had not looked back at the door. She was already moving to Iris's other side. The man on the porch was still there. She could feel him looking. The barn is warmer than out here. His voice was rough and unhurried, the voice of someone who had stopped softening things for other people's comfort some years back. He was not looking at May when he said it. He was looking at Iris. He stepped back from the door and opened it the rest of the way. I wasn't speaking to you. I was speaking to the girl. May did not say thank you. She understood that was not what this moment required. Rope Callahan was the name on the carved wooden piece above the door, which she read by lantern light once they were inside, and she had a moment to look at something other than her immediate surroundings. The cabin was one main room with a smaller door at the back that presumably led to a sleeping room, and it smelled of pine smoke and gun oil and the particular dusty loneliness of a space that had held only one person for a long time. The fireplace dominated the south wall, and the fire in it was real, not performative, built by someone who heated by fire rather than by choice. A cast-iron stove in the corner, with a coffee pot sitting cold on top of it. A table heavy enough to have been built in place. 2 chairs, one with a leg wrapped in rawhide, where the original joint had given out. On the mantelpiece, she saw it immediately because she noticed things that were out of place, and this was precisely in place, which was its own kind of out of place. A woman's bonnet, small with a blue ribbon gone limp, set there with care, not hung set. The difference was significant, and she filed it away without looking at it directly. She helped Iris to the better of the 2 chairs, the one with all its original legs, and Iris folded into it, with a sound that she probably did not mean to make. Wade appeared in the doorway carrying 2 of their blankets, and the man, Rope, moved out of his path without comment and went to the fire and added a piece of wood from the stack beside the hearth, and that was the extent of what he did. He stood at the far side of the room, his back partially to the wall in the way of someone who had been in enough uncertain situations to know where to put his body without thinking about it. He watched. That was what he did. He watched, and he did not make small talk, and he did not offer anything, and May found this almost restful after weeks of encountering men who filled silence with words because they were afraid of what silence might ask them. She found the basin under the dry sink and filled it from the water barrel in the corner, and carried it to Iris and unwrapped the red scarf and felt the girl's forehead, which was warmer than it should have been. Not fever-breaking bad, not yet, but the kind of warmth that was making a decision. She found her kit in the bag she kept closest to her on the wagon bench, the one she would grab first in an emergency, and she had bandaging and willow bark and a tin of salve that was getting low and needed to last, and she began to work. She was aware of him watching. She was aware that he had not asked a single question. Nora was building up the fire in the stove from coals that were still alive in the ash, and Wade had gone back to the wagon to bring in the rest of what they needed for the night. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, the man named Rope sat down in the rawhide-legged chair, and May noticed that the motion of lowering himself into it cost him something he was careful not to show. Left leg. He settled the leg at a specific angle and left it there, and did not shift it for the rest of the evening. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. Later, when Iris had been made as comfortable as possible, and Nora and Wade had settled into their blankets on the floor near the stove, and the fire had burned low enough that the room existed mostly in the amber shadow between dark and dark, May went to the dry sink and pumped water into the coffee pot because there was coffee in a tin on the shelf, and she decided without discussion that making coffee was a reasonable thing to do at this hour. She set 2 cups on the table. He came to the table. He sat across from her with the specific deliberateness of a man accepting something he had not decided to accept yet. He looked at the cup and then at her, and she poured, and he did not thank her, and she did not expect him to. How long have you been on the road? Not a question in his voice. An observation looking for confirmation. 4 weeks. From where south? He picked up the cup. That's a direction, not an answer. I know. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. The answer is more complicated than tonight requires. Something moved in his expression then. Not a smile, too brief and too private to be a smile, but something in the vicinity of one like a light in a far window. He drank his coffee. She noticed his hands, because she always noticed hands. You could read a person's history in their hands if you knew what to look for. His were large and work-roughened, with the specific callus pattern of someone who used a rifle regularly and handled rope even more regularly, and there was an old scar across the back of the right one shaped like a question mark, which she found appropriate. The knuckles of the left hand had a faint swelling at 2 joints that spoke of cold weather and old injuries. He had been wearing a ring on the left hand once. The skin there was slightly different in tone. Not much, just enough. She did not look at the bonnet on the mantelpiece. They sat for another few minutes in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her, because quiet with strangers was usually one of 2 things, hostile or forced. This was neither. It was simply 2 people existing in the same space after a long day, with enough in common not to need to perform. She stood to go to her blankets. Your mule doesn't usually do that. He said it to his cup. She stopped. What? Stop on a trail for no reason and then walk to a specific door. He looked up. That's not what mules do when they're tired. That's what they do when they've made a decision. May thought about that for a moment. Solomon usually knows more than I do. Most animals do. He looked at the fire. Get some sleep. She went to her blankets. She did not sleep. She lay with her coat across her shoulders, listening to the particular sounds of the cabin settling against the cold, and the slow breathing of Nora and Wade and Iris, and the absolute absence of sound from the direction of the rawhide chair, where she was reasonably certain rope. Callahan was not sleeping either. Sometime very late she heard him stand, move to the window, a small sound of paper. She kept her breathing even. The cabin held whatever it held, and she listened to it, and eventually the gray before dawn began to show at the edges of the window, and she got up before anyone else because she had things to do before the day had opinions about them. She swept the cold ash from the firebox. She brought in water from the well, which required breaking a skin of ice on the bucket with the heel of her palm. She set the oatmeal to cook on the stove, and found the coffee, and made a second pot, and found the broom behind the door, and swept the floor. She did not do these things because she felt obligated to. She did them because a clean space thought more clearly than a dirty one, and she needed to think very clearly today. She was stirring the oatmeal when she heard the uneven rhythm of his step behind her. You should still be resting. He had a voice that was used to carrying across distance, even when he was being quiet. She did not turn around. So, should you? A beat of silence. I wasn't asking for help, I know. She stirred. You keep saying things that are true, but don't change anything. He went to the table. She heard the chair. A long pause. You didn't ask before you started. I didn't think asking would have helped. Another pause. It wouldn't have, I know. She ladled oatmeal into the bowl she had found on the shelf. So he said nothing for a moment. Then, fair enough. Wade came in from the barn where he had slept with Solomon, because Wade had decided 3 days ago that Solomon's company was preferable to confined spaces with people, a preference May respected without fully understanding. He carried a bucket of water from the well, and water slopped over the side because he was walking fast, and thinking about something other than the water. Rope watched him from the table. Slow down. Wade looked at him. He was 20 years old, and he had spent most of those 20 years being told to hurry up. Sir, the water doesn't care how fast you're moving. But your arms do. A pause. Try it again. Wade went back to the door and walked in again, slower, and the water stayed in the bucket, and he made the porch and the threshold and the floor without losing a drop. He looked at the bucket and then at Rope with an expression that was trying to be casual and not quite succeeding. Rope said nothing. He picked up his coffee cup, but May had been watching from the stove, and she saw the tiny shift in his jaw, the almost not there thing at the corner of his mouth, and she turned back to the oatmeal before anyone could catch her seeing it. After breakfast, while Iris rested, and Nora read from one of the books on the shelf she had pulled down without asking, Wade went to the well again, and May found herself in the yard for the first time in real daylight. The cabin looked different in November morning light, or rather, it looked exactly like what it was, which was a structure built by someone who knew how to build and had been maintained by someone who had stopped caring about maintenance but had not stopped doing it entirely. The distinction mattered. The fence posts were solid, but the rails between them had not been replaced in 2 seasons. The barn door hung plumb, but the rope pull on it had been repaired with a different rope that didn't match. Someone was keeping the essential things and letting the cosmetic things go, which was the maintenance pattern of grief, not laziness. She noted it and did not remark on it. She was coming back across the yard when she saw it. Near the east fence, about 30 feet from the cabin wall, the soil was compressed differently from the surrounding ground. Not from wagon wheels, not from boot prints, the kind of compression left by a horse that has stood in one place long enough to shift its weight repeatedly. One horse. And the prints leading to and from the spot pointed south-southwest, but the tracks approaching the fence from the tree line came from the north. Someone had come from the north and departed to the south-southwest. She crouched beside the nearest print. The ground had been frozen since, so the print was locked in. This had happened at least 2 days ago, possibly 3, not a wanderer who had strayed off the trail. The position was deliberate, angled to have a clear sightline to the cabin door and the well. She stood. She walked back to the cabin without hurrying. She set her face back to neutral, which was where she kept it when she needed to think, and she went inside and she stirred the pot of beans she had put on for midday, and she did not say anything. Rope came in behind her 5 minutes later. She knew he had seen the prints too, because she had learned to read the quality of his silences in the 12 hours she had known him. And this one was different. He sat down at the table. She brought him coffee without being asked, and he looked at her across the rim of the cup. 2 days ago, he said. Maybe 3. That's what I thought. Not a lost rider. No. He set the cup down. He looked at the fire. You want to tell me what I found in my coat pocket 2 weeks ago at Red Hollow? She had gone very still. Not because the question surprised her, because it didn't. He reached into the inside pocket of the leather vest, hanging on the peg beside the door, and he produced a folded piece of paper, and he set it on the table between them, and he left his hand flat on the table, not on the paper. Beside it, a deliberate not claim. She looked at it. She already knew what it was. She had seen copies of it in 3 different towns, on the way north, tacked to notice boards outside general stores and sheriff's offices, which was how she had learned to scan notice boards from a distance before entering any town rather than after. She reached across and picked it up and unfolded it. Her own face looked back at her from the paper, rendered in the economical lines of someone who was good at likenesses, good enough that she recognized herself immediately rather than having to think about it. Beneath it, May Calloway. Theft of charitable assets. 3 counts. Unlawful detention of persons under legal guardianship. 1 name at the bottom of the paper, printed in the clean official type of an organization that employed a printing press as a tool of legitimacy. Crane Foundation. Below that, in smaller type, a reward figure that told her exactly how much Aldous Crane believed she was worth, which was more than she would have guessed and less than she had cost him. She folded it back along the original creases and set it on the table. She looked at him. He had been watching her. Read it. He was still watching her. You didn't come to Red Hollow looking for that paper, she said. It was not a question. No. A pause. Someone handed it to me at the trading post. Said there were copies going out across the territory. He looked at the paper on the table between them. You've been on that paper since at least 2 weeks ago. Longer than that. How much longer? Long enough. She kept her hands still on the table. What are you going to do with it? He picked up the paper. He looked at it for a moment. She watched his face, which did not change, which she had already begun to understand was not the same as nothing happening behind it. He stood up and walked to the fireplace and held the paper to the flame at the edge of the nearest log, and she watched it catch and curl and blacken from the corner inward, and he held it until the last corner was gone, and then dropped the ash into the grate. He came back to the table. That doesn't mean I trust you. He sat down. It means I haven't decided yet. She could breathe again, which told her she had not been breathing quite right for the last several minutes. That's enough. For now. He picked up his coffee cup. Tell me one true thing. She thought about that. About what was true, and what was true and useful, and what was true and useful tonight specifically. The people with me are not being held against their will. They came with me because they chose to. If you asked any one of them to confirm that, they would. He considered this. That's the least damning thing you could have said. I know. She looked at the fire. It's still true. Outside, Solomon was standing in the open doorway of the barn with his nose pointed toward the tree line, and both ears straight up, which was the position he took when he was listening to something that had not yet resolved itself into something he could name. The evening wind moved through the lodgepole pines, with the low sound of a river that wasn't there. And down below in the valley, the last light was going from blue to black in the efficient way of mountain evenings that did not linger. In the cabin, the fire built itself into warmth, and the beans on the stove filled the room with a smell that was almost enough to convince a person that things were going to be all right, which was not the same as things going to be all right, but was not nothing either. Iris slept. Nora read. Wade came in smelling of hay and animal warmth and sat on the floor near the stove and tilted his hat over his face in the universal posture of a young man who is about to pretend to sleep while actually listening to everything. Rope Callahan sat in his chair at the table with his injured leg at its careful angle and a cup he was no longer drinking from, and he looked at the fire with the expression of a man having a conversation with himself about a decision he had already made but had not announced yet. May sat across from him and did not press. She understood, better than most, that some decisions needed to be made in the space between people, rather than in the words between them. She had been making her own decisions in exactly that space for 4 weeks, and before that for 3 years, and before that for her entire life, which had been a long apprenticeship in understanding the difference between waiting for permission and waiting for the right moment. This was the right moment, not because anything had been resolved, not because they were safe, or because she trusted him, or because the burned paper in the grate meant anything other than a temporary reprieve from a decision that still had to be made, but because Iris's breathing had eased a little, and Nora had stopped sitting with her backed to the wall for the first time in 4 weeks, and Wade's shoulders had come down from around his ears, and Solomon had finally lowered his head in the barn doorway and begun to pull at the hay in the manger, and because the man across the tipple from her had watched all of that happen and had not moved toward the door. She got up to take the beans off the heat. The woman's bonnet, she said, without looking at the mantelpiece. A long pause. She could feel the shape of the silence behind her. My wife. 2 words and a full stop that meant the subject was, and was not over simultaneously. She kept her back to him, ladling beans into the bowl she had found that morning, and she said only, I'm sorry, not because she felt she needed to say something, because she meant it exactly as much as those 2 words could carry and not 1 syllable more. He did not respond for a long time, long enough that she had set the pot back on the iron plate and turned around. His eyes were on the mantelpiece, not the bonnet exactly.
The space around it,
he said, to the fire, not to her. She passed last January. He picked up the empty cup, put it down. In the storm. The week when nothing moved on the roads and the nearest doctor was 2 days' hard ride. And it didn't matter because by the 2nd day, he stopped. It didn't matter. May sat down. She did not try to fill the space after that. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the pine trees, a night bird made a single sound and did not repeat it. She would have made them all tea, he said eventually, with something that might have been rye and might have been grief wearing rye as a coat. The minute they came through the door, before she knew a thing about them, she would have already had the kettle on. May looked at the coffee she had made without asking, and the beans she had put on, without asking, and said nothing about what she had done. And he looked at the same things and said nothing either, and the fire went on burning in the grate. Later, after the others were asleep, and the cabin had gone quiet in the specific way of mountain cabins in the hours before midnight, May lay under her blanket and looked at the ceiling and listened. There was no sound from the table except the occasional shift of weight in a chair, which told her Rope Callahan was still sitting where he had been sitting when she had closed her eyes, not sleeping, not moving toward the door. She counted her own breaths until they slowed. Outside, Solomon stood in the barn doorway again, nose lifted, ears forward, looking north into the dark that the cabin light did not reach. He stood there for a long time. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere up the slope, a branch cracked under ice weight and fell. Solomon lowered his head. Not yet, the posture said, if you knew how to read a mule. Not yet. But the thing he had been listening for was still out there, past the tree line, in the dark that didn't announce itself. Still there, getting closer. 3 days passed, the way things pass in high country in November, which is to say they passed without asking permission and without announcing themselves, and the only way you knew time had moved was by the angle of the light through the window and the depth of the ash in the firebox. On the first of those 3 days, Rope woke to find the oatmeal already made, and the floor already swept and the water already hauled, and he stood in the middle of his own cabin with the specific disorientation of a man whose environment has been reorganized without his consent, and found that he did not quite object. He wanted to object. He had prepared a version of himself that would object. But the oatmeal smelled like something worth eating, and the floor was cleaner than it had been in 2 months, and so he sat down and ate and said nothing, and May stood at the stove with her back to him, and also said nothing, and between them the silence had already shifted from the previous night's careful negotiation into something more like two people who have agreed on the broad terms without spelling them out. For something, and he did not thank her. She did not seem to need him to. On the second day, the broken chair that had been leaning against the wall since October became no longer broken. Rope came in from checking the fence line and found May on her knees beside it, with a wood screw she had found somewhere, and a strip of rawhide for reinforcement, and the chair was already upright on 4 functioning legs before he got his coat off the peg. I was going to fix that. He looked at it. When? Not accusatory. Genuinely curious. A pause that went on long enough to constitute an answer by itself. I had intentions. The chair couldn't wait for your intentions. She stood, brushed dust from the front of her skirt, and went back to the stove. It needed weight-bearing capacity. He looked at the chair, he pulled it out and sat in it deliberately, and it held. He said nothing, but something in his posture made a quiet concession that she did not notice, because she had already moved on to the beans. On the 3rd day, Iris sat up on her own and ate a full bowl of oatmeal, and told Nora that the scarf was too tight, and Nora said it was not tight at all, and Iris said Nora's was dramatic, and Iris said Nora was a tyrant, and both of them said these things with the ease of people who have had this particular argument many times before and find it comfortable, rather than aggravating. Rope observed this exchange from the doorway, with the expression of a man watching something he has not seen in a long time, and is not sure what to do with the recognition. Wade had discovered, somewhere in the 2nd day, that Rope knew things about horses and mules and saddles and trailcraft that Wade very much wanted to know, and he had attached himself to Rope's general vicinity the way iron shavings attach to a magnet, which is to say completely and without embarrassment. Rope answered about half of Wade's questions. He let the other half sit unanswered, and Wade, to his credit, eventually figured out that the unanswered ones were the ones he was supposed to work out for himself. Why do you hold the cinch ring that way? Wade watched Rope's hands on Solomon's saddle, which he had taken apart, and was inspecting the same way. He apparently inspected everything he found in his barn, with the quiet thoroughness of a man who trusted his own eyes above any previous owner's word about condition. Because the other way pinches your fingers if the mule moves. A pause. Has the mule moved on you yet? 3 times. So Wade looked at his own hands, both of which bore the evidence of this lesson, and switched his grip without further comment. May was aware of all of this. She was aware of most things that happened in a 40-foot radius, which was not a talent so much as a trained response to years of needing to be, but she watched Rope with Wade in particular, and added what she observed to the file she was building in the back of her mind, the one she kept on every person she depended on, even temporarily, the one that answered the question, not of whether someone was likable, but of whether they were reliable when the situation required something other than goodwill. Rope Callahan was reliable. She could see it in the specific way his attention sharpened when something needed attention. Not reactive. Proactive in the way of a man who had spent decades anticipating problems before they announced themselves. She wanted to trust that. She was not ready to trust that. Not yet. The morning the stranger came, Solomon told them first. Iris had been in the yard with a heel of bread crust, which Solomon had accepted from her hand every morning. Since their arrival with the dignity of an animal who considers such offerings his due rather than a gift, they were engaged in what had become their morning routine. Iris talking softly about whatever was in her head, and Solomon listening with one ear while monitoring the broader environment with the other. When Solomon stopped chewing, both ears came forward. Not the gradual attention shift of an animal, hearing something interesting. The abrupt full stop of an animal that has recognized something specific. Iris looked toward the south trail, which was the direction Solomon was looking. She walked back inside without hurrying and without finishing the sentence she had been in the middle of, and that was enough. May was already at the window by the time she crossed the threshold. A rider, coming up the south trail at an easy pace on a roan horse that moved with a slight irregularity in the right front step. Not quite a limp, but the early conversation between a horse and an injury. The man on it was middle-aged, wearing a brown canvas duster over what appeared to be plain working clothes, with a hat pulled low, and the road-worn look of someone who had been in the saddle since morning or longer. He raised a hand when he cleared the tree line and saw the cabin, which was the standard gesture of a man announcing himself as non-threatening, which Rope had once told during one of the long years she had spent learning things that mattered, was also the standard gesture of a man who had been trained to appear non-threatening. She did not know that Rope had told her that, but she knew it. Rope was already on the porch by the time the rider reached the yard. Morning, the rider's voice had the easy warmth of someone who was good at first impressions and knew it. Rope's hands rested at his sides. Morning. My horse could stand a drink, if you've got a well to spare. Help yourself. Rope did not move from the porch. The rider dismounted with the fluid ease of a man, accustomed to long hours, in the saddle and led the roan toward the well, and he talked while he walked, filling the air with the comfortable small change of trail conversation. The early cold coming down off the peaks, the trouble with wolves taking calves on the eastern range, 2 counties over, the price of winter feed. He had a laugh that arrived quickly and sounded genuine, and this was exactly the detail that made the back of May's neck go cold, because genuine-sounding laughs were easy to learn and hard to distinguish from the real article unless you had spent years listening for the difference. She stayed inside. She watched from the window, and she watched the way a person watches who is not watching the thing they appear to be watching. The rider drew water and gave it to the ronin, then drew more for himself and drank from the ladle and looked around the yard the way people look around yards, which is to say he was looking at the yard and also at everything in it and also at everything the yard said about who lived there and who might be visiting. His eyes passed over the wagon beside the barn, the way eyes pass over something when they have been told to appear uninterested in it specifically. May had done the same thing in reverse enough times to recognize the technique. He glanced at Solomon, and then away, and then back briefly, and away again. Not at the wagon, not at the hay bale, at Solomon. Her hands tightened on the window frame. He was asking himself if he had seen that mule before. He was asking himself in a way designed not to look like a question. You folks settled here long? He had wandered toward the woodpile, hands easy at his sides, posture relaxed in the manufactured way of a man whose body was doing one thing and whose attention was doing another. Rope had not moved from the porch. Long enough. Nice spot. Good water. The rider nodded at the mountains. Hard winters, though. We manage. Iris came around the corner of the cabin at this point, which was the worst possible timing, and also inevitable because the yard was where she went when she needed air, and she had not known there was a stranger in it. She stopped when she saw the rider. The rider's eyes went to her, and then past her, with the practiced brevity of someone who has learned to register details quickly, without appearing to register them at all. May was through the cabin door and onto the porch before she had finished deciding to move. "They're with me." Her voice came out level, and she was glad of that. The rider smiled with the warmth he had been warming her with since he cleared the tree line. "Cute family you've got." May pushed her lips into something that required no internal support. "We're staying while Mr. Callahan's leg heals." "That right." He looked at Rope. "Bad fall?" "Horse." Rope's voice had not changed in any way May could quantify, but she noticed that he had moved one step forward on the porch, which put him at the top of the steps rather than back against the wall. Know the feeling. The rider picked up his reins. "I've been put down by better horses than I could afford." The easy laugh again. "Heading to Redfield myself. My sister keeps a place out that way." May did the arithmetic that she had already done. The moment he said, he came up the south trail. Redfield was south. He had come from the north. Not a slight deviation, not a trail that curved, but the north, which was the opposite of Redfield by a significant margin. She kept her expression where it was. He tipped his hat to her, and to Iris, and to no one in particular, and rode back down the south trail at the same easy pace he had arrived with, and the yard was quiet again, and Solomon watched him go with the sustained attention he gave to things he had not finished deciding about. Rope came off the porch and walked to the spot near the well, where the rider had stood longest. He crouched, which cost him something in the knee, and looked at the ground. Then he stood and looked at May. She was already looking at him. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the man had come from the north and claimed he was going south, and had looked at Solomon with the attention of someone searching his memory for a matching image. They did not say it because Wade was 10 feet away, and Iris was still standing near the corner of the cabin, and some information traveled better in smaller company. Rope went inside. May went inside. The door closed behind them. He came from the north. She said it first, because she had been holding it since the rider cleared the tree line, and the pressure of holding it had become uncomfortable. "I know." He looked at Solomon. Rope had gone to the shelf on the far wall, the one above the dry sink, where he kept things he used regularly and things he could not quite bring himself to put away. He took down a canvas binder, the kind used for field records and official correspondence, worn at the corners and retied with a different cord than the original. He set it on the table and opened it and turned pages with the specific purpose of someone who knows what they are looking for. "His name is Roy Tasker." He turned the binder to face her. Inside was a page covered in handwritten notes, and at the bottom, a sketch of a face. Not a professional likeness, but close enough. The man from the yard looked back at her from the page. "He worked out of the Four Corners division when I was there. I dismissed him in '76 for taking payment from the people he was supposed to be documenting. Smaller operations than this." He paused. "I haven't seen him since. Someone told him where to find me." May sat down. This required 2 pieces of information arriving at once, and she needed a moment to let them settle into each other. The first piece, the man in the yard was not a coincidental traveler. The second piece, his presence here required knowledge of Rope's location, that Rope had not made available to the general public, which meant someone who knew both where Rope was and what Rope looked like had told someone connected to Aldous Crane where to find a woman and a mule. The 2 pieces made one conclusion. He's already seen what he came to see. She pressed both palms flat on the table surface. "He's not going to Redfield." Rope closed the binder. "No, he's going to wherever Crane set up for the winter." He met her eyes. which is why we don't have as much time as I thought we had." This was the first time he had used the word we in reference to their situation as a shared problem, rather than her situation as an adjacent inconvenience, and May registered it without acknowledging it, because acknowledging it would have made it strange, and it was not strange, it was simply accurate. That evening May sat by the window with the mending in her lap, which she had taken up without asking, because Rope's shirts were starting to express opinions about their own structural integrity, and she was not able to look at a solvable problem and decline to solve it. Across the room, Rope was working on the chair that still needed its back rail tightened, using a small tool she did not have a name for, the kind of specialized implement that lived in a man's toolbox, because someone else put it there, and he had kept it because the someone else was gone. He did not look up from the chair. "You don't have to fix those." She made a stitch without looking up from the shirt. "I know. I keep saying that, and you keep doing it anyway. Because you keep saying things that are true but don't change what needs doing." She turned the collar to get the angle right. "The shirts need it." He was quiet for a moment. The tool made a small, satisfied sound against the wood. "Fair enough," he said, and she heard the faint weight behind it, the same weight as the night before and the night before that, a man learning a new grammar, and not entirely sure he trusted it yet. Later, after the others had settled, Rope sat at the table with a lamp and a piece of paper, and May saw that he was writing a letter, but she was across the room and the angle was wrong for reading it, and she was not the kind of person who craned. He folded the letter and sealed it and set it beside the lamp, and that was all she could observe, without being obvious about observing. She filed it. She had been awake for 3 hours before dawn when she slipped her coat on and took the small oil lamp and went to the corner of the main room where the canvas bag she kept closest to herself was stored. She set the lamp on the floor and opened the bag and found the inner section, the one with the stiffened bottom, and drew out the leather notebook she had taken from Crane's office on the last night she was inside it. She had been inside Crane's office precisely 4 times. 3 times to clean it, which was her assigned work, and once on purpose, in the middle of the night, with a candle she had borrowed from the kitchen stores and a window she had unlatched 3 weeks earlier while cleaning the glass and had not relatched. The notebook was not large. It had belonged to Crane's bookkeeper originally, a small man named Atterbury, who had died of influenza in the spring of last year and whose replacement had not yet been told what the notebook contained, and whose absence Crane had apparently not noticed until May had walked out with it. The pages were covered in 2 different handwriting styles. Atterbury's was cramped and consistent, the writing of a man who was very careful with numbers. The second style, which appeared only on the last 12 pages, was larger and more assured, and it belonged to someone who signed his work with the initials MF. She turned to the last of those 12 pages. The signature there was full, not initialed. She had read it enough times that she could see it with her eyes closed. Judge Marcus Fell, Associate Justice, Colorado Territorial Court. His signature appeared on 6 of the transfer contracts she had copied out by hand onto the preceding pages. The contracts that moved people from St. Agnes's legal custody, with its hollow paperwork, into the custody of ranches and households and work arrangements that Crane's Foundation administered, which is to say controlled, which is to say profited from in amounts that Atterbury had also recorded in his cramped and consistent hand. Without that last page, the notebook was evidence of a pattern. With it, the notebook was evidence of a conspiracy that reached from Crane's office all the way into the structure that would be responsible for adjudicating any charges brought against Crane. Marcus Fell would be the judge at any trial held in Colorado territory involving Crane Foundation. She put the notebook back and refastened the inner section and put the bag back in its place and sat with the lamp for a while in the silence of the cabin, listening to the sounds of people sleeping, which she had been listening to for 4 weeks, and which she did not think she would ever entirely stop finding remarkable. People trusted sleep in a way they could not always trust anything else. Sleep required surrender, and surrender required safety, even the provisional, conditional, borrowed safety of a cabin on a hill with a stranger who had burned a wanted paper rather than act on it. She was about to take the lamp back to its hook when she noticed the drawer of the side table was slightly open. Not all the way, just enough that the thing inside it was visible at the edge. She had not opened that drawer before. She had a rule about not opening drawers or boxes or folded papers that did not belong to her, because she had lived under the thumb of a man who opened everything, and she knew what it felt like to have your private things handled by uninvited attention. But the lamplight caught the edge of the envelope and she saw the name on it before she could redirect her eyes. Eleanor. In handwriting that was Rope's. She recognized it from the letter he had been writing at the table, the same deliberate strokes of a man who wrote rarely and carefully. The date in the upper corner was January 14th of this year, which she did not need to calculate because she already knew from what he had told her that Eleanor had died in January. The letter had never been sent. Obviously, that was not the part that stopped her breath. The part that stopped her breath was that it had been written on the night of her death, or after, or during the long hours of a storm that did not allow for anything except staying and writing and things you could not say to the person who could no longer hear them, and it had been left in the drawer with the envelope addressed and the flap unsealed, because sending it had never been the point. She pushed the drawer closed with one fingertip, quiet as she could. She went back to her blankets, she went back to her blanks, and she looked at the dark ceiling. And she thought about a man sitting at that table in January in a storm writing to his dead wife. And she thought about a girl in St. Agnes at 14 years old, writing the names of people she was afraid of losing into the back cover of a Bible, because she had learned that if you wrote things down they were less likely to disappear entirely, and she thought that grief was less a feeling than a practice, something people did with their hands and their eyes and their particular late-night habits when the daytime arrangements of composure had run out of hours to hold. She slept eventually. Not for long. The morning she decided to make the map, she woke before anyone else, which was early enough that the sky over the eastern peak was still the purple black of genuine night, with only the suggestion of gray beginning at the edges. She dressed, coat over her calico dress, wool stockings and her boots, with the buttons she had replaced twice on the left side because the left side took more punishment, and she went outside with the lamp turned low enough to be useless as a signal. She walked the perimeter of the cleared land in a loose circle, stopping at intervals to face outward toward the tree line and note the angles. She had not been trained to do this. She had been afraid enough times in enough different topographies that the knowledge had accumulated without her seeking it, the way calluses accumulate, through repeated contact with rough surfaces. From the northeast corner of the fence, you could see the full south trail and the upper section of the east trail and the barn roof, but not the cabin door. From the position beside the dry creek bed, 30 feet past the west fence, you could see the cabin window and the porch and the well, but the trees closed off your view of the north approach at about 200 yards. She found two positions in the tree line to the north that had clear sightlines to the cabin from cover. Both showed evidence of having been used, not recently. Branches at the height, a man on horseback would push aside getting into position, with a slight discoloration where the bark had been repeatedly rubbed. Someone had used those positions more than once over a period of time long enough for the trees to show it. She stood in the second position for a moment and looked at the cabin from it. From here, you could see the door, the window, the well, the porch. You could see anyone entering or leaving. You could count heads if the heads were in the yard, and you were entirely invisible from the cabin, because the line of sight that let you see out did not let anyone in the cabin see in. She went back inside. Rope was up, which did not surprise her. She had begun to understand that he slept the way she slept, in the tactical intervals of people who had learned that full unconsciousness was a luxury that required either total safety or total exhaustion, and that neither condition was something to count on. He looked at her coat and her boots and the color of the outdoor cold on her face and said nothing. She went to the shelf and found a piece of paper, which there were several of, because Rope was apparently a man who kept paper, for reasons she had not yet identified. and she spread it on the table and sat down with the stub of pencil she kept in her kit and began to draw. She drew from memory and from the mental notes she had been making. Since Solomon walked up the trail 3 nights ago, the kind of notes you kept in the part of your mind that functioned below the level of conscious decision, because you had trained it to observe without being asked. She sketched the cabin at the center, the fence, perimeter, the tree line positions, the 2 points where the trail entered the cleared land, the sight lines from the north positions to the cabin openings. She drew it quickly, because she had found that maps drawn quickly from memory were more accurate than maps drawn slowly from trying to be accurate, because trying to be accurate introduced the gap between what you had seen and what you wished you had seen. Rope came to the table and looked at the paper over her shoulder without touching it. Northeast corner, she said, pointing with the pencil. You can see the south trail from there. If someone is watching the cabin from the north positions, they cannot see the northeast corner. A pause. You went out before light to check the positions. I went for air. You drew a tactical map. She set the pencil down. I went for air, and then I drew a tactical map. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she could feel the shift in the quality of his attention, the way it moved from observer to participant. He looked at the map. He reached across and made a small mark at a point on the west tree line that she had not included. There's a dry wash behind that stand of spruce. You can move through it below the sight line from the north position and come out behind the barn. He made another mark. If they bring horses, they'll use the east approach because the footing is better, and they won't know you'd have that covered from the northeast corner. She looked at the 2 marks. She looked at him. You've thought about this cabin's vulnerabilities before. It was not an accusation. It was the recognition of one kind of mind encountering another kind of mind. I think about every structure's vulnerabilities. He sat back. It's a hard habit to stop. 20 years. 20 years. He looked at the map. You've been doing this less than 20 years, and your instincts are better than some marshals I worked with for a decade. She did not respond to the compliment, not because it did not register, but because responding to it required acknowledging something about herself that she had never said out loud and was not sure was safe to say. That she had been learning to survive since she was old enough to understand that survival required learning. That the years at St. Agnes had been an education in attention and resource management and reading the motivations of people who held power over you, and that these skills did not stop being useful when the context changed. That surviving one thing prepared you, in specific ways, for surviving the next thing. She picked up the pencil. If Tasker reports our position, they will come from the north, because that's the direction of Black Creek, and that's where Crane keeps his winter operation. She drew a line. They will want to arrive before we can move, which means they will come at night or before dawn, or both, or both. She set the pencil down again. We need a reason to be at a specific public location at a specific time before they can choose their own time and place. Rope was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the map, and then at something past the map, in the middle distance where a man looks when he is working through a problem that has multiple layers, and he is checking them in order. Red Fork Bridge. He met her eyes. 2 hours east on the Hatcher's Mill Road. The bridge crosses the Red Fork River at a point where the road widens into a public thoroughfare. Anyone who uses the east-west road uses that bridge. Public location. She understood. Anyone who takes an action there takes it in front of witnesses. And anyone who takes an action there and later regrets it cannot claim it happened in private. May looked at the map. She thought about Aldous Crane's face, which she had seen from the cleaning closet doorway a dozen times in the years she had worked in the building he owned, and which she had studied with the careful attention of someone who knew that her safety depended on correctly predicting what was behind it. Crane was a man who valued the forms of things. He would not want to take an action in public that could not later be characterized as lawful and appropriate. He would want to be seen to be operating within the structure of proper authority. The same authority whose signature was in the last pages of a notebook, currently under the false bottom of a canvas bag on the floor of this cabin. She gathered the map and the pencil and folded the paper twice and put it in her coat pocket. "There's something you need to know about the notebook," she said. He waited. She told him about the last 12 pages, about Atterbury's handwriting, and the second handwriting, and the initials, and the full signature on the final page. She told him about Marcus Fell and about the nature of what that signature meant for any trial held in Colorado territory. He did not interrupt her. He had the quality of stillness that came from genuine attention rather than politeness, the kind that meant he was filing everything she said, rather than waiting for the parts that confirmed what he already thought. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "Crane knows that page exists." He said it as a statement, not a question, because it was obvious once you understood Crane's organizational habits. He knows it exists. He doesn't know if I found it. He suspects. He always suspects. It's how he operates. Rope turned his cup on the table surface, a slow rotation, thinking. Tasker wasn't here to confirm your location, or not only that. He looked at the cup. He was here to see if he could identify where you'd hidden it. She nodded. He looked at the wagon specifically. A man looking for something someone is protecting looks for what they keep closest to them. He set the cup down. "The notebook is in the wagon." She held his gaze. "The notebook is in my kit. And the last page?" A beat. "The last page is not with the notebook." She watched his face. "It hasn't been with the notebook since the 3rd day on the road. If someone takes the notebook, they get 11 pages of Atterbury's numbers, and my handwriting, and 6 contract copies, without the signature that gives them weight." She paused. What they're looking for would not be where they expect to find it. Something moved in his eyes that was not quite surprise, and not quite the absence of surprise, but something in the specific territory between them. He looked at her with the assessment of a man who had spent 20 years estimating the capabilities of people he encountered and was recalibrating one of those estimates upward. "Where is it?" he asked it, his gaze. "Safe." He accepted that. He did not push it, which told her something about the kind of man he was, because pushing it was the obvious move, and he had declined it on some basis she would have liked to understand better. She stood to start breakfast. "I sent a letter this morning," he said to her back, "with the Hatcher's Mill mail rider who comes up the North Trail on Tuesdays." She turned. He was looking at the table. "There's a man in Hatcher's Mill, a reverend named Amos Cole. He's been in this part of the territory for 30 years. He traced a line on the table surface with one finger. He and I have a history that I won't explain right now because it requires more time than we have this morning. What matters is that he knows things about Crane's operation that he has been sitting on for reasons that are his own and that I have never agreed with." May felt the particular stillness of a person who has received information that requires careful handling. "You wrote to him before you knew about the last page." "Yes." "You were preparing something before you told me you were preparing it." "Yes." He looked up. "I didn't know if I was going to need it. I didn't know enough about what you had or what you were planning or whether any of it was real." A pause. "I know more now." She stood with the porridge spoon in her hand and looked at him. He had been working on the same problem she was working on, in parallel, for at least the last 2 days, and he had not said so, and she had not said so, and they had arrived at the same conclusion by different routes, and neither of them had known the other was moving. She was not sure whether to be reassured or unnerved by that. She decided reassured, because the alternative was that she was alone in this, and she was very tired of alone. "Will he come?" She turned back to the stove. "I don't know." A pause and something honest in it, something that cost him a small amount to admit. "I gave him a reason to. Whether it's enough depends on things I can't control." "Most things do." "Yes." He picked up his cup. "Most things do." That night, 2 hours past midnight, May woke to the sound of something she could not immediately name. She lay still for several seconds, breathing shallow, cataloging the sounds of the cabin. Nora's even breath from across the room. Wade's heavier rhythm from behind the blanket they had hung to divide his corner. Iris's small sounds, comfortable now, the fever fully gone for 2 days. And from outside, past the cabin wall, in the darkness that the window showed as nothing but its own reflection, a sound that resolved itself slowly into something with structure and direction. Hoofbeats, moving at a walk. Multiple horses, from the north, coming down the slope toward the valley in the deliberate, measured pace of riders who believed they had not yet been heard. She was at the window before she had finished waking up. The torchlight was already visible through the trees. Not one light. 4, possibly 5, moving through the pine stands in a configuration that was not the configuration of travelers using a trail. They were spread out, wider than the trail required. They were not following the trail. They were fanning around it, moving to come at the cleared land from multiple angles rather than the single point of the road entrance. She had described exactly this possibility to Rope that morning over the map on the table. She put her hand on his shoulder, where he lay in the chair he had taken to sleeping in, rather than the back room, and he was awake before her hand made full contact, which told her he had not been deeply asleep. She did not need to say anything. He was already at the window. They stood side by side and watched the torchlight work its way through the trees, and the count of lights resolved to 5, and the spread of them resolved to the encircling pattern she had feared, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "They're not coming in tonight." His voice was very quiet. "They're establishing positions. How long do we have?" He calculated something she could not see the working of, in the part of a marshal's mind that existed below the surface, and dealt in distances and speeds and human behavior under pressure. "Before they're ready to move on us. Not long enough to outrun horses on a loaded wagon." She looked at the torchlight. She thought about the bridge at Red Fork. She thought about public ground and witnesses and a signature on a page that was not where anyone would think to look for it. "Then we don't outrun them," she said. "We lead them to where we want them." He was quiet for a moment, and then, with the specific economy of a man who had learned not to spend words on things that were already settled, Red Fork Bridge. She turned from the window. "Wake the others." They packed in the dark without lamps. May had learned, over the previous 4 weeks, that light was a message. It announced you. It said, "Here is where we are, and here is what we are doing, and here is how long it will take us." And she had stopped being willing to send that message to people she had not chosen as recipients. So they packed by touch and by the faint gray that the snowfield on the upper slope threw back into the valley, enough to see shapes without seeing detail, which was all they needed because they had each been keeping track of where their things were since the first night in the cabin. Wade moved the equipment from the back room. Rough, with the quiet efficiency of a young man who had discovered that silence was a skill rather than an absence, which was one of the more useful things he had learned in the past 3 days. Iris carried the blankets and folded them with the compulsive neatness she applied to things she could control, when the things she could not control were too large to look at directly. Nora did not speak and did not need to be told anything, and May had long since stopped being surprised by this, because Nora's ability to read a situation without annotation was one of the reasons May had reached for her first on the night they left St. Agnes. Rope came from the back room with a Winchester he had loaded, in the dark, which she knew because she had heard the specific small sounds of the process, the lever and the gate and the lever again, without him needing a lamp to guide his hands. He wore the leather vest over the flannel and his hat and his gloves and the long canvas coat that hung by the door, and he moved with the measured economy of someone who was managing the leg without letting it manage him. She was finishing the harness on Solomon when he came to stand beside her. "The east trail," he said. "Stay in the ruts. The footing is better, and the tree cover holds until about a 1/4 mile from the valley floor. And the west position, they'll be moving into it now. If we go east, we're ahead of them for the first 1/4 mile." She checked the chest strap. Solomon stood absolutely still for this, which he did not always do, and which meant he understood that stillness was the appropriate response to the current situation. She had never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction how a mule understood the emotional register of a harness check, but Solomon consistently did. "There's something I haven't told you." She kept her hands on the harness. She had been carrying the sentence around since the night before, and she was putting it down now because they were leaving, and because what was ahead required him to understand it fully. "The last page. The one with Fell's signature. You said it was safe. It is. But safe means it's not with the notebook." She turned to look at him over Solomon's neck. I hid it separately the third day on the road, before I knew where we were going. Before Hatcher's Mill, or the bridge, or any of it. A pause. If someone takes the notebook, they have 11 pages and contract copies without the key evidence. What Tasker went looking for under the wagon is not what he found. He was quiet for a moment, in the specific way of a man processing new information against a plan he has been building, checking for structural changes. Where is it? My Bible. Under the back lining. Another pause. And you're telling me this now because if something happens to me at the bridge and you have the notebook but not the page, you need to know where to look. She turned back to the harness. And because you made a plan and sent a letter without telling me, so. The quality of his silence shifted. She heard something in it that was not quite a sound, just the texture of a man reassessing a person for the third time in as many days, and finding each reassessment required more room than the last one had. Fair, he said. She clicked the trace into the singletree. Also, what you said about Reverend Cole, about how whether he comes depends on things you can't control. She gathered the reins. Most important things do. But the ones worth doing are worth doing anyway. He looked at her across Solomon's back for a moment. He did not respond. He did not need to, because she had not said it to get a response. She had said it because it was true, and because truth required saying when you were about to drive a wagon, when you were about toward a confrontation with a man who had been buying and selling people in official paperwork for 3 years. They went east. The trail held them in its frozen ruts, and the tree cover closed over them, and behind them the cabin sat dark on its shelf of hillside. Not dark because it was empty, but dark because they had made it empty deliberately, and the 5 torches that had been moving through the pine stands on the western approach would find that darkness when they arrived and would have to recalculate, which would cost them time. And time was what May had bought herself every single day of the past 4 weeks by making decisions before other people were ready to respond to them. Solomon did not need to be encouraged on the East Trail. He set his pace without being asked, and the stubborn taindist, with the stubborn steadiness that was his primary mode of being in the world. And the wagon followed him, and the 4 people on and in the wagon followed the wagon, and the valley fell away behind them, as the trail climbed briefly over a low shoulder of hill before dropping toward the eastern flatlands and the Hatcher's Mill Road. The sky was beginning to consider dawn. Not commit to it, just consider it. May held the reins, and she thought about the notebook in her kit, behind the seat, and the page in Bible, and the bridge they were moving toward, and the specifics of what she was planning to do when she got there, which was to say, she was planning to tell the truth in a public place to people who would hear it and remember it. And she was aware that this plan had several significant uncertainties built into its foundation. The primary one being that she did not know who would be on the other side of the bridge, or how many of them there would be, or whether Reverend Amos Cole had read Rope's letter and made the decision that Rope had given him a reason to make. She was also aware that this was not substantively different from any other plan she had ever made, in that it required other people to behave in ways she could not guarantee, and that this had always been the central vulnerability of every plan, and that no amount of preparation had ever resolved it, and so she had long since stopped trying to resolve it and had started trying to accept it instead. Accept it. Keep moving. Those were the only options. An hour before they reached Hatcher's Mill, Rope told her about Jonas Reed. He did it without preamble, sitting on the bench beside her with his coat collar turned up against the pre-dawn cold and his hat brim low, and his voice at the level of something meant only for her. Not because he was uncertain about saying it, but because it was not the kind of thing that needed to be said loudly. In the spring of 1876, he had arrested a man named Jonas Reed on charges of taking a young woman named Clara Reed from the lawful custody of her guardian. Paperwork was complete. The witness testimony was consistent. The representative of the organization that held Clara Reed's legal custody appeared in person and provided documentation of impeccable quality, and Rope had served the warrant because the warrant was legal and the documentation was impeccable, and he had been serving warrants for 19 years, and he was not in the habit of doubting impeccable documentation, because Jonas Reed had maintained his innocence throughout. He had said, clearly and consistently, that Clara was his niece, and that she was being held against her will in conditions that would harm her, and that he was the only person who was going to do anything about it, and that the law was being used as a weapon against both of them. He said all of this, and Rope had listened to all of it and had put him in a cell, because the paperwork said the paperwork, and the witnesses said what the witnesses said, and that was how the law worked. 3 months later, Clara Reed died. The facility that held her reported it as illness. The representative of the organization that had provided the impeccable documentation sent a formal notice of death and a formal apology and a donation to the county charitable fund. And Jonas Reed was still in a cell, and Rope was the man who had put him there. He resigned 6 weeks after he received the notice. He had come to the mountains, and he had not gone back. He said all of this without inflection, which was not the absence of feeling, but the specific qualities of plele, of feeling that had been held under enough pressure, for long enough that it had changed state, the way water held under sufficient pressure became something other than water. He said it looking at the trail ahead, and his hands rested on his thighs without moving. May listened. She did not try to find the sentence that would make this better, because there was not one. She had spent enough years in the vicinity of damage done by powerful organizations using official paperwork as weaponry to know that there was nothing to say to someone who had been a part of that machinery, even unknowingly, even having resigned from it in consequence. What she did say was this: the organization that sent the documentation was the Crane Foundation. He did not answer because the answer was already known to both of them. The witness who confirmed the custody arrangement, she said. Was it a man named Harker? Small, precise, with a habit of folding his hands when he spoke. A pause. Yes. He worked for Crane directly. He was the one who managed the documentation process. She kept her eyes on the road. He retired to somewhere in Nevada 2 years ago. Crane stopped needing him once he had the system running without individual management. Another pause, longer. He said, not a question, not even quite a statement. It was the specific cadence of a realization that had been building underground for a long time and had finally broken the surface. He needed me out of the Four Corners division. I was the senior deputy in the territory with enough history and enough standing to make an investigation stick. He manufactured a reason to discredit me, and then waited for me to remove myself. And you did. And I did. A long moment. The road curved and Solomon took the curve at his own measured pace. I did his work for him. She waited to see if he needed silence or something else. He appeared to need neither. Or rather, he appeared to have passed through whatever it was the telling had required, and arrived on the other side of it in the same posture he had been in before, which was upright and forward-facing, and in the business of the immediate situation. It changes what you're going to do at that bridge, she said, knowing. It clarifies what I was already going to do. A beat. There's a difference. She considered this. Between what you know is right and what you know you're responsible for. Between having a principle and having a debt. He looked at the road. I owe Jonas Reed something I can't pay to Jonas Reed. The closest I can get is not leaving you at that bridge without someone who knows what they're looking at. The sun was coming now. Not up yet, but committed. The sky to the east going from the gray, that looks like nothing to the pink that looks like something. The mountains defining themselves against it, with the stark clarity that high country only has in winter, when there is nothing between you and the actual shape of things. They passed through the eastern edge of Hatcher's Mill at first light. The town was small in the way of genuine mountain towns, which is to say functional without ornamentation, with a main street that was a road with buildings alongside it rather than a design. The general store, the feed merchant, the office of the territorial surveyor, a church with a practical steeple, a small hotel that also served as a post office, which was where Rope had sent his letter through the Tuesday rider. People were beginning their mornings. A man in a sheepskin coat moving between buildings. A woman beating dust from a rug hung over a porch rail, which struck May as optimistic given the hour and the temperature. 2 riders coming in from the North Road, which she watched until they passed the cross street and continued in a direction that was not toward the bridge. She kept her face toward the road. Nora was in the wagon bed, sitting upright with her arms around her knees, watching the town through the canvas opening, with the assessment of someone who was measuring it against some internal standard for safety. Iris sat beside her, the red scarf back in place, and her color restored over the past 3 days, watching the same things and making her own measurements. Wade was up on the seat between May and Rope, too tall for the space, folded like something built for a larger scale, watching everything with the avid attention of a young man who had grown up in contained places and found the outside world requiring constant study. They came out of the town's east end and onto the Hatcher's Mill Road proper, and the bridge was visible ahead, half a mile or so, a wooden structure over the Red Fork River where the water moved below a skin of ice at the edges and ran dark and quick in the center channel. The road widened at the bridge as Rope had described, a public thoroughfare, with enough space for 2 wagons to pass, which was why it was the kind of place where things witnessed were truly witnessed, because there was no reason to be at that bridge except transit, and transit meant multiple parties. She saw them when they were still a quarter-mile out. 5 riders on the far side of the bridge. The one at the front wore a black coat, fitted, expensive-looking even at this distance, and a hat that had never known field work. The 2 beside him wore deputy stars that caught the morning light. Roy Tasker was on the left, and she recognized the slope of his shoulders before she recognized anything else about him. The 5th rider hung back slightly, which she took to mean he was waiting for a signal rather than acting on his own judgment. And in front of the 5 riders, standing on the bridge itself, with her wrists loosely bound in front of her, was Nora. May heard the single small sound from inside the wagon that meant Iris had seen it too. She kept Solomon moving at the same pace, because changing pace was information, and she was not ready to give information yet. She looked at Nora. Nora was standing straight, which was the posture Nora used when she was frightened and choosing to be upright about it, and she was looking at the wagon coming toward her with the expression of someone who is trying to communicate something specific with only their face. She was not hurt. That was the first thing May read. The second thing she read was the set of Nora's chin, which was at the angle of someone who was angry rather than merely scared, which was Nora's particular mode of handling situations that felt unjust, and which May found appropriate given the situation. Rope's hand came to rest on her arm. Once briefly, steady. I'm steady. She was also calculating, which was a different thing from steady but was compatible with it. She was calculating Tasker's position on the bridge, and the deputy stars on the 2 beside Crane, and the fact that the 5th rider was positioned for withdrawal rather than engagement, and she was calculating what it meant that Crane had taken Nora instead of waiting to take all of them at the cabin, which was the more efficient approach if efficiency was the goal. Efficiency was not the goal. This was a performance. Crane wanted witnesses. He wanted May Calloway seen arriving at this bridge and seen being presented with a problem that required her to make a choice in public. He wanted her choice to look like capitulation to lawful authority rather than the outcome of a 3-year campaign of manufactured paperwork and purchased testimony. He wanted the story to be, the woman gave up because she was wrong and she knew it. She pulled Solomon to a stop at the near end of the bridge. The wooden planks were 30 feet of crossing between her position and the 5 riders and Nora, which was far enough for conversation, and close enough that conversation was unavoidable. Aldous Crane urged his horse forward 2 steps. From this distance, she could see his face properly, and it was the face she had seen from the cleaning closet doorway on a dozen occasions, and it was wearing the same expression it had always worn, which was the expression of a man who believes the outcome of any situation is a matter of administrative management rather than human decision. Miss Calloway, his voice carried well. He had the voice of someone who had learned to use it as an instrument. I appreciate your willingness to meet here. She looked at Nora. Are you hurt? Nora's chin came up another fraction. No. They were quite polite. A pause that carried an entire editorial in it. For kidnappers. Crane's expression did not shift. Miss Vale is under the legal protection of the Crane Foundation, as are Mr. Briggs and Miss Doyle. Removing her from an unregistered location to a place of safety is entirely within our authority. Rope swung down from the bench to May's left. He moved to the bridge entrance and stood there with the Winchester in his right hand, barrel down, which was not a threat but was not a threat either. It was the posture of a man who has decided to be present in a way that has weight. One of the deputies shifted in his saddle. Crane looked at Rope, and his expression gained a specific quality, a thinning around the eyes that was not quite recognition, but was the place recognition lived. "Mr. Callahan, I was wondering how long it would take. Were you?" Rope's voice had no warmth in it and no hostility either. It was the voice of a man who had stopped having feelings about the person he was speaking to, because feelings were not the useful tool in this situation. "You've spent 20 years bringing people who break the law to account." Crane's tone was almost gentle. "I would hate to see you compromise that reputation on behalf of a woman who has demonstrably done exactly that." "You keep talking about the law," Rope said. "I'm not sure you've spent enough time with the actual article to know what it looks like up close." Something moved through the riders behind Crane, not quite a reaction, the near reaction of people who are not permitted to react. Tasker's eyes went to May and then back to Rope, and in them, she read the specific calculation of a man who had worked with Rope for years and was reassessing everything he thought he knew about where this situation was heading. The deputy with the stars on the left urged his horse forward one step. He was young, which she had not been able to see from the wagon, and his discomfort was visible in the set of his jaw, the too careful way he was holding his reins. "Ma'am, I have a warrant for your arrest. Charges of theft and unlawful detention. I need you to come off that wagon." She looked at him, not at Crane, at him, because he was the one with the warrant and the star and the discomfort, and she had learned over 4 weeks of being pursued by the apparatus of official authority that the people who held the papers were not always the people who had written them, and that the difference mattered. "What's your name?" she said. He blinked. "Deputy Harlow." "Ma'am, Deputy Harlow, I am going to step down from this wagon. Not because of the warrant, but because I have been trying to get to this bridge for 2 days, and I have something to show you." She looped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down from the bench, and her boots hit the bridge, planking, with a sound that was louder than she expected, the hollow percussion of wood over water. "The warrant you're holding was obtained on the basis of documentation that will not survive examination. I am prepared to demonstrate that to you here, in front of everyone at this bridge, if you are willing to look at what I have." Crane's voice came with the smooth precision of a man returning a serve in a game he was certain he was winning. "That's a bold claim from a woman who stole those documents in the first place." She turned to face him fully. The morning light was behind her, which she had not arranged, but which she noted, because light behind you was better than light in your eyes, and she would take whatever useful accident the situation offered. "I am going to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it in front of Deputy Harlow." She kept her voice level and clear. "Did you, at any point between January and August of 1876, employ a man named Bernard Harker to provide witness testimony in a custody dispute in the Four Corners territorial jurisdiction?" The thinning around Crane's eyes became something else. Not anger, calculation. The recalibration of a man who has heard a name he did not expect to hear at this location. "I employ a great many people in the course of charitable work," he said. "I don't see the relevance." "The relevance," she said, "is that Bernard Harker's testimony in that case resulted in the wrongful arrest of an innocent man and the subsequent death of the person that man was trying to protect." She paused. "And that the case was in the jurisdiction of Deputy U.S. Marshal Rope Callahan, which is not a coincidence, and I can demonstrate that it isn't." She reached into her kit and withdrew the leather notebook and walked to Deputy Harlow and put it in his hands. For a moment nothing moved. The river ran under the bridge with its quick dark sound. Solomon stood on the near bank and breathed cold steam into the air. Crane's horse shifted its weight and he steadied it with one hand without looking at it. Harlow opened the notebook. He turned the first page. The second. She watched his face rather than the pages, because she had read the pages enough times to have them in memory, and his face was what was useful now. Crane's voice came in while Harlow was still reading. "This document was stolen from a private office. Any evidence it contains is the product of a criminal act. He was still smooth, still patient. But the patience had an edge in it now, the way ice has an edge when something is moving under it. Furthermore, there is nothing in that notebook that would be admissible in any court in this territory. In any court presided over by Judge Marcus Fell, she said. The bridge went very quiet. Harlow looked up from the notebook. Tasker looked at Crane, then looked away. Crane said nothing for a moment that lasted the full measure of several breaths. When he spoke again, the gentle register was gone. Not replaced by anger, by precision. Miss Calloway, you are making accusations against a sitting federal judge that you cannot possibly substantiate. The last 12 pages of that notebook are in Marcus Fell's handwriting and carry his full signature. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. That signature appears on 6 separate transfer documents authorizing the movement of persons from the custody of St. Agnes to locations administered by your foundation. Those transfers were made in exchange for payments that are also documented in 2 different handwriting styles in the same notebook. She paused. The original of the last page is not in that notebook. It is in a secure location. But the documentation in Deputy Harlow's hands is sufficient to establish the pattern, and the original page is available to any legitimate court that requests it. Harlow looked at Crane, then at Rope, then at the notebook in his hands. Crane turned to Tasker and made a small specific gesture, the kind of gesture that passes between men who have worked together long enough to have a private language of motion. Tasker's hand moved toward his coat. Rope's Winchester came up, not pointed, raised, barrel at chest height, not aimed but present, the unambiguous communication of a man who has made a decision and is communicating that decision without theater. Don't, Rope said. One word. The voice he used for it was not loud and was not soft. It was the particular register of absolute certainty which carries further than shouting and lands differently than threat. Tasker's hand stopped. Wade appeared from around the back of the wagon, and he had in his hands the old Remington that Rope had shown him how to load 2 days ago, and told him he hoped he would never need to use. And his hands were not entirely steady, which was honest, and his eyes were, which mattered more. Harlow was still looking at the notebook. He turned another page. His jaw had tightened in the way of a young man, confronting something that requires him to make a decision he was not briefed for. Then, from the far side of the road that fed onto the bridge, from the direction of Hatcher's Mill, a wagon, smaller than theirs, moving at a pace that was not urgent but was also not casual. A man on the bench, old, with the upright posture of someone who had spent decades being the tallest moral presence in a room and had let the posture become structural. A dark coat, a collar that announced his office. Reverend Amos Cole brought his wagon to a stop at the eastern edge of the bridge. He climbed down with the careful deliberateness of a man in his late 60s, who has decided not to let age be an excuse for slowness and has not entirely succeeded. He carried a bundle of papers under one arm, tied with cord. He walked onto the bridge, past the 5 riders, past Crane, who turned to look at him with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man encountering the unexpected and not yet knowing how to categorize it. Aldous. Cole's voice was not a match for Crane's in polish or projection, but it had something Crane's voice did not, which was the quality of belonging to a man who had not spent the last 3 years managing what he said. I should have done this a long time ago. Crane's voice came back quickly, too quickly, the quickness of a man covering ground before the other person can make it theirs. Amos, this is not your situation to involve yourself in. It became my situation when the first set of those papers came through my church for notarization. Cole set the bundle on the rail of the bridge and began untying the cord with hands that did not shake. I notarized them because you told me they were standard transfer documents for charitable placement. And then the people in those documents stopped writing back. And then I found out why. He lifted his eyes to Crane's. And then I did nothing for 3 years because I was frightened, which is a thing I will have to live with. He pulled the topmost document from the bundle and held it out toward Harlow. These are my church records, the originals. Every document I notarized for the Crane Foundation beginning in the spring of 1876. Each one of them has a corresponding entry in the notebook you're holding that will tell you exactly what happened to the person named in it. Harlow took the document. He looked at it, and then at the notebook, and then at the space between the two, which was the space where the pattern became visible. Crane turned to the deputy on his left, not Harlow, the other one. This is a coordinated effort to subvert a lawful warrant with fabricated testimony and stolen documents. I expect you to act accordingly. The second deputy looked at Crane. He looked at the notebook in Harlow's hands. He looked at Cole standing on the bridge with his church records in his arms and his chin, at the angle of a man who has finally found the specific kind of courage that only comes after you have run out of reasons not to have it. I don't know what I'm supposed to act on, the second deputy said. I need to send a wire to the marshal's office. You need to do your job, Crane said. The patient's gone now entirely. My job is to serve lawful warrants. Harlow closed the notebook. I'm not certain this warrant is lawful. He looked at May, and I'm not making that determination on a bridge without more information than I currently have. Then, from the direction of Hatcher's Mill, more sound. Hoofbeats. Not the organized rhythm of a posse, but the irregular percussion of several people arriving separately, in the way of people who have heard something and have come to see what it is. Which was the thing that happened in small territories when an event required an audience, and the audience arranged itself without being invited. 6 riders from the town. Then 4 more on foot. A woman from the general store, her apron still on. 2 men from the feed merchant who had closed the door behind them. And from among them, moving on foot with the long stride of a man who had been walking since before light and had not yet decided to stop, a figure May did not recognize. Younger than Rope, older than Wade. A scar that ran from his left ear to the point of his chin, silvered over with years. He wore working clothes that had been mended multiple times, and boots that had covered serious distance, and he walked through the gathered people of Hatcher's Mill, as if he had been walking toward this specific point for a long time, and was relieved to have arrived. He stopped at the edge of the bridge. He looked at Crane. He looked at the riders. He looked at May, and she did not know his face, and she did not look away, and he looked at the notebook in Harlow's hands. My name is Daniel Pruitt. His voice was the voice of someone who has been deciding what to say for a long time, and has finally resolved the question. I worked on a ranch in the San Luis Valley for 4 years under a contract. I was not given the option to refuse. That ranch was administered by the Crane Foundation. He pointed. Not at Crane's organization, or Crane's foundation, or Crane's paperwork. At Crane. At the man. He signed my contract. Nobody moved. The river ran under the bridge. I got out 3 years ago. Daniel Pruitt did not lower his arm. I've been trying to find someone who would listen for 2 of those 3 years. He looked at Harlow. I'll take an oath if you need one. I'll take it right here. Behind him, from among the gathered people of Hatcher's Mill, a second voice. A woman's. Older. Steady. My nephew. He was placed through that foundation in 1877. We haven't had a letter. A man beside her, I know 3 families looking for people that went through that organization. Another voice, from further back, that she could not see the origin of. The bridge had become a place where the private had become public, which was exactly what May had planned for, and had not been certain of, which was the gap between planning and reality that she had learned to exist inside, without resolution, because there was no other way to do it. Crane looked at the growing crowd. He looked at the notebook in Harlow's hands. He looked at Cole and his church records, and Daniel Pruitt's extended arm, and the woman asking about her nephew. His hand moved toward his coat. Not slowly, not telegraphed. The motion of a man who has run the calculation and arrived at the conclusion that what he is about to do is the only remaining option, which was the most dangerous kind of conclusion, because it removed other options from consideration. Rope had been watching Crane's coat since the moment Cole appeared on the bridge. He had been watching it the way a man watches something he hopes does not require him to act, in the specific posture of someone who has been in enough situations to know that the moment before a situation escalates is both the last moment it does not and the first moment it must be managed. The Winchester was already in position when Crane's hand reached the lapel. Don't. The same word as before. The same register. Absolute and without theater. I am asking you, as a man who spent 20 years understanding how this ends, please don't make me do something you won't survive. Crane's hand stopped at the lapel. For a moment that stretched long enough to contain a whole season of consequences, nothing moved. Then Harlow reached out and took Crane's arm, and the second deputy came around from the other side, and the specific procedural sounds of an arrest in progress filled the bridge over the Red Fork in the cold morning air of a Colorado November, and Nora walked forward from the position she had been standing in. Since May arrived, and the loose cord around her wrists fell off because it had never been tied properly, which was either an oversight or a message that Nora had kept to herself. And she walked across the bridge, planks, in her worn calico and her patched wool coat, and she stopped in front of May and looked at her for a moment. I knew you were coming, Nora said. I just didn't know from which direction. May took her hand, held it once firmly, let go. She walked back to the wagon. She climbed up to the bench. She climbed to the bench, and she picked up Solomon's reins, and he lifted his head from whatever he had been considering in the road dust, and looked at her over his shoulder with the patient attention of an animal who has been waiting for this specific moment to be over. I know, she said to him. Me too. Behind her on the bridge, the sounds of consequence continued their work, and the people of Hatcher's Mill stood in the cold morning and watched it, and the river ran under the planks with its dark indifferent current, and the mountains to the west held the last of the night in their upper reaches, while the valley below them, filled with the ordinary difficult light of a day that was going to require people to do things they had not expected to do when they woke up. May sat on the bench with the reins in her hands, and she breathed. She breathed for the first time in 4 weeks, without measuring the breath against a contingency. The weeks after the bridge had a texture that May had not anticipated. She had anticipated difficulty. She had anticipated the slow grind of official process, the depositions and the document reviews, and the careful reconstruction of everything that Crane's organization had done across 3 years of impeccable paperwork. She had anticipated that being right would not feel as clean as being right was supposed to feel, because she had been right before about smaller things and had learned that correctness did not come with the emotional settlement that people described when they talked about justice. What she had not anticipated was the quiet. Aldous Crane was taken to Denver on the 3rd day after the bridge, transferred to federal custody when the U.S. Marshal's office in Pueblo received Deputy Harlow's wire and dispatched 2 senior men who arrived at Hatcher's Mill on horseback with their credentials and their own set of papers that superseded the local warrant. She did not watch him go. She was at the cabin when it happened, reorganizing the contents of the storage area of the wagon by order of priority, which was the task she defaulted to when she needed her hands occupied and her mind working at a separate layer. Nora told her about it afterward. He had walked to the federal deputy's horses, with the posture he always had, upright and contained, and he had not spoken. And the people of Hatcher's Mill, who had gathered at the edge of the road, had watched him go, in the specific silence of people who are reconsidering everything they thought they knew about a man. Nora had watched from across the road and had felt, she said, less than she expected. Not nothing. But less than 3 years of fear had prepared her to feel. It should be bigger, Nora said that evening at the cabin table. The moment when the thing you've been afraid of stops. May thought about this. It's not smaller than it should be. It's the right size. We just spent so long imagining it larger than life. Nora looked at her hands. Is that supposed to help? No. May put down the spoon she had been using to stir the beans. It's just true. Rope! From the doorway, said nothing, but she heard him shift his weight on the doorframe, which was what he did when he was listening to something he wanted to remember. The formal dismissal of all charges against May Calloway came 6 weeks later, delivered in an envelope from the territorial court, sealed with the court's own mark, and addressed to her in handwriting, and addressed to her that was clearly a clerk's rather than a judge's, which was how official exonerations arrived, with no ceremony and no acknowledgement that what was being dismissed had cost anything to obtain. She opened it at the table on a Tuesday morning, with Wade eating breakfast across from her, and read it twice and folded it along the original crease and put it in her Bible behind the last page, which was where she kept things she needed to be able to find again. Wade was watching her. Well, she picked up her fork. That's it? That's it. He looked at the Bible. You're not going to say anything else about it. I just did. He made a sound that was not quite exasperation and not quite amusement, and returned to his breakfast, and she returned to hers, and the morning continued its business around them, with the complete indifference of mornings to the significance of what happened in them. She did not tell Rope that day. She told him the next morning, early, before the others were up, because it felt like the kind of information that required quiet rather than an audience. She handed him the letter across the table with her coffee cup in her other hand. He read it. He handed it back. Good, he said. That's all. He looked at her over his cup. What else would you like me to say? She considered this. I don't know. Something that acknowledges that it took 6 weeks and a federal investigation and 3 years before that and a man on a bridge with a rifle. It took all of that. He set the cup down. And it worked. And you knew it would work, or you wouldn't have driven toward the bridge instead of away from it. He picked the cup back up. Good covers all of that. She sat with this for a moment, and then she decided, without quite deciding, that he was right. The winter settled over the San Rafael Range in the particular way of Colorado winters, that do not ask permission and do not apologize for their ambitions. The snow came first in the upper elevations, and then moved down into the valley in stages, covering the long grass and the ruts of the trail and the corner posts of the fence in a sequence that was less an event than a process, snow arriving the way most permanent things arrive, gradually and then all at once. Rope's leg had been healing steadily since the night he had walked onto the bridge without the gate's support, because he had decided that the bridge was not a place for visible limitation. The decision had cost him 2 days of additional recovery, but had apparently been worth it in his own accounting, and she had not told him whether she agreed because he had not asked, and because watching him make that particular decision had told her something specific about his character that she was still working through the implications of. He did not accept help he had not requested, but he also did not decline it when it was offered without being attached to a transaction. These were different things, and she had learned them separately, the way you learn the specific vocabulary of a person over time. Wade had, in the weeks since the bridge, attached himself to the blacksmith operation in Hatcher's Mill, with the focused energy of a young man who had found the thing his hands were built for. He walked the 3 miles down the valley road, each morning, in his canvas coat and his battered hat, and came back in the evening smelling of iron and coal smoke, with the satisfied weariness of someone whose exhaustion had been earned in a specific and useful direction. The blacksmith, a man named Hector Gaines, who was approximately the size of 1.5 normal men, and had the patience of someone who had worked with fire and uncooperative metal for 30 years, had apparently decided within the first week that Wade Briggs was the closest thing to an apprentice he had ever encountered who was worth the trouble, and Wade had decided, approximately, simultaneously, that Mr. Gaines was the closest thing to a mentor, worth the trouble of being corrected by. Nora worked at the postal station 3 days a week, and, on the other 4, Shai helped with the cooking, and the mending, and the kind of household maintenance that existed in the space between the things that were someone's specific job and the things that needed doing anyway. She had also taken over correspondence for 2 of the older residents of Hatcher's Mill who could not write well enough to manage their own affairs, and she did this without payment, in the mornings before she needed to be anywhere else, sitting at the table with her careful script and the particular small expression of someone who has found useful thing they can do and has decided to do it without announcement. Iris had not gone to town to work. She had, instead, begun to draw with the seriousness of someone who had always had the capacity and had simply not had the material conditions that allowed it to expand. Rope had found, in the back storage area of the barn, a cache of supplies that Eleanor had kept, including several good quality drawing pencils and 2 books of heavy paper of the kind used for surveying records, and he had set them on the table one morning without comment, and gone outside, and Iris had sat down and not stood up for 4 hours. The drawings were of the valley. Not the valley as a pretty thing, though it was that, but the valley as a place, with the specific weight and shadow of particular times of day, and particular weather conditions, the way the snow looked in the hour before the light left it, and the way the pines at the tree line held darkness inside them even at midday. Rope had looked at them once briefly when Iris left them on the table to dry. He had not said anything to Iris. He had said to May, in the kitchen, with his back to the drawings, "She sees what's actually there." Yes, May was cutting potatoes for the evening meal. She always has. A pause. It's a harder skill than people think. Most valuable ones are. She could feel him thinking about whether to say the next thing. She had learned the rhythm of that particular pause over the weeks they had been living in proximity, the way she had learned the rhythm of Solomon's hesitations, which were not stubbornness, but deliberation. "Eleanor painted," he said, "to the window rather than to her. Not well, by her own judgment, though I always thought she was wrong about that. She said she saw what she wanted things to be instead of what they were. A beat. Said it made for pleasant pictures and inaccurate records." May set down the knife. Did that bother her? It was a distinction she had made peace with. He turned away from the window. Some people do better work making peace with their limitations than fighting them. She was one of those people. He picked up the water bucket and went outside to the well, and May picked up the knife again. And the kitchen went on being the kitchen in the particular comfortable way that a kitchen becomes comfortable when it has had people working in it consistently for long enough that the space has adapted to the purpose. The federal investigation into the Crane Foundation produced results over the following months in the ways that official processes produce results, which was to say slowly and through the accumulation of specific documented instances, rather than through any single dramatic revelation. Judge Marcus Fell resigned from the territorial court before the first formal inquiry reached him, and attempted to relocate to somewhere in the Utah Territory, which did not work because the federal warrant that followed his resignation arrived before he did. Reverend Cole testified twice, in Hatcher's Mill first, and then in Denver, and each time he sat in his straight-backed way and gave his account in the same level voice, and May heard afterward from Harlow, who had stayed in contact at a professional distance, that she found respectful rather than intrusive, that the testimony was precise and complete and did not flinch. Daniel Pruitt had stayed in Hatcher's Mill for 3 weeks after the bridge, long enough to provide his full, formal deposition and to eat several large meals at the hotel and to sleep in a bed for the first time in longer than he wanted to specify. He left on a Tuesday morning on a horse he had purchased with money he had saved in the specific methodical way of someone who knows that escape requires preparation, and before he left he came to the cabin. Not for any stated reason. He stood on the porch, and May opened the door, and he looked at her with the steady eyes of a man who had made a long journey toward a single necessary moment and was now on the far side of it. "I spent 2 years trying to find someone who would listen," he said. "I just wanted you to know that it wasn't you I found. You found me." A pause. "That matters to me more than I expected it to." She held the door frame. "Where are you going?" "West." He looked at the mountains. "I've had enough of this specific part of the country for a while." He stepped off the porch. "But I know where the cabin is, in case that's ever relevant." She watched him ride down the valley road until the trees took him, and she stood on the porch for another moment. After that, in the cold air, thinking about the geography of finding and being found, and whether there was a meaningful distinction between the two when the outcome was the same. Rope appeared in the doorway behind her. "He'll be all right." "I know." She came back inside. "He's been all right for 3 years already. He just didn't have anywhere to point it." The question of what came next presented itself in the way that important questions presented themselves, not as a formal inquiry, but as an accumulation of small practical specifics that added up to a larger one. Nora had her work at the postal station. Wade had Hector Gaines and the blacksmith shop. Iris had her paper and her pencils and the valley that was inexhaustible as a subject. These were not temporary arrangements. They were the early shapes of a life, in a place, The kind of shapes that hardened into permanence if you let them, and dissolved if you didn't. May had not let herself decide yet whether they were hardening or dissolving. She had been suspicious of permanence for long enough, that her relationship with it was complicated, and she had been moving for long enough that stopping required a deliberate act of will rather than simply the absence of a reason to continue. Rope did not push this question. He was not a man who pushed questions, but he had a way of being present in situations that made it difficult to pretend the situations were not occurring, which was, she thought, probably as deliberate as everything else he did. One afternoon in January, the anniversary month of Eleanor, he came in from the barn and found May at the table with her Bible open in front of her, not reading it, holding the dismissal letter she had put there in the fall. She did not close the Bible when he came in. She had been sitting there long enough that she had stopped caring what she looked like sitting there. He sat across from her. He did not ask what she was doing. After a long moment, the letter tells you it's over. Yes. But you knew it was over before the letter. Yes. She looked at the paper. The letter tells me officially. Which is different. Official doesn't change the facts. No. But it changes what I'm allowed to do with them. She set the letter down. For 3 years I have been a woman with a story that no one would write down. The letter is someone writing it down. He was quiet for a moment, and now that it's written down. She looked at him. Now I have to figure out what I'm doing in a borrowed cabin in Colorado in January. He held her gaze. The cabin stopped being borrowed around the time you fixed the chair. She felt something shift in the room, or in the quality of the air in the room, or in the quality of whatever it was that existed between two people who had been in proximity long enough to have stopped pretending they were strangers. That's not a practical answer, she said. No. He turned his cup on the table. This is a practical answer. He looked at the cup rather than at her, which was where he looked when he was saying something he had prepared rather than something that came out of the moment. And she had learned this distinction too. The cabin needs a room added before next winter. Not because there isn't space now, but because there will need to be. He paused. Wade can help with the framing. He has more skills than when he arrived. She understood what he was saying. She was going to make him say it plainly anyway, because she was, at her core, a woman who valued precision and had been misunderstood too many times by people who assumed they knew what she meant to let imprecision stand unchallenged in the other direction. You're going to need to be more specific than that. He looked up from the cup. I would like you to stay. Not in the way that people stay when they have nowhere else to go. In the way that people stay when staying is what they choose. She looked at him. She thought about Solomon on the trail in November, 4 months ago, stopping in front of a door because he had made a private calculation and arrived at a private conclusion. She had trusted that then. She had trusted it since. You should know, she said, that I have never been good at making things easy. I've noticed. And I will fix things that need fixing without asking whether you'd prefer to fix them yourself. I've noticed that as well. And I will have opinions about how the water situation in the spring needs to be managed before the thaw. His mouth moved in the direction of something. You've already had those opinions. You told Wade about them last week. I was going to tell you eventually. I know. The something reached its destination, May. She stopped. He said her name the way he said things he had thought about, before saying, with the specific weight of someone who does not spend words carelessly, and therefore makes the words he does spend carry the full value of what they cost him. I know, she said. And then, because she was honest, she added yes. The specific nature of what happened in Hatcher's Mill on the second Saturday of April was that Rope Callahan walked into the town square at midday with May Calloway and stopped in the middle of it and said what he said, and the people of Hatcher's Mill were there, because Saturday midday was when they were always there, because the general store had its weekly sale, and the post was distributed, and the week's business got settled, and so there were approximately 30 people to witness the fact that a man who had lived alone on a mountain for two years had come down from it and was standing in the public square of their town, making a declaration in front of all of them. He had not told her he was going to do this. They had walked into town for Saturday business. As they had done for the previous several Saturdays, and she had been thinking about the seed order for the kitchen garden and whether the south-facing wall of the barn would support climbing beans. And then he had stopped walking, and she had stopped walking, and she had looked at him, and he had the expression of a man who has made a decision and is implementing it before he reconsiders. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I am going to say it here, because I was a man who lived in the dark for 2 years and I have had enough of dark, and things worth saying are worth saying where they can be heard." She looked at the people around them, several of whom had already stopped their business to look back. She felt the specific quality of 30 pairs of eyes that did not know what they were about to witness. "You are aware," she said carefully, "that there are people watching. That's why I chose here." He turned to fully face her. "I spent 20 years being the kind of man who did his work quietly and kept his own counsel and believed that the official record was the only record that mattered. And then I resigned and went up a mountain and kept my own counsel louder, and found out that loud silence and quiet silence are the same problem." A pause. "You are not a quiet problem. You came through my door in November with a mule and a mission, and you fixed my chair and drew a tactical map before dawn, and burned the only copy of your own wanted paper, and walked onto a bridge to tell the truth to people who had been paid to disbelieve it." He looked at her. "I would like to marry you. I would like you to know that I am saying this in front of 30 people in Hatcher's Mill, because you deserve to have someone choose you publicly and without reservation, after 3 years of being officially characterized as the wrong kind of woman." The town square had gone very quiet, not the watchful quiet of people waiting to see what happens next. The different kind, the quiet of people who have recognized that they are present at something that does not require them to do anything except witness it. May looked at him. She thought about the night on the porch when he had put his hand on hers for 1 second and taken it back, and the morning she had found the letter to Eleanor in the drawer, and the afternoon he had set the drawing supplies on the table without comment, and the way he had stood on the bridge with a rifle held barrel down and said the same word twice in the same voice and meant it completely both times. She thought about Solomon, who was tied to the post outside the general store and who could not see them from there, but who was, she was quite certain, aware of what was happening in some way that did not require line of sight. She thought about what it cost a man who had kept his own counsel for 20 years to stand in a town square and say a thing out loud. She put it together in less time than it looked like from the outside. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." Something happened in his face that she had not seen happen before. A complete and unmanaged expression. Brief as struck light. The face of a man who has been prepared for several outcomes and has received the one he wanted, and has not yet organized his response to it. It lasted approximately 1 second. Then he was himself again, which was the version of himself she had come to know. And he took her hand, and she let him, and the 30 people of Hatcher's Mill produced a collective sound that was somewhere between surprise and satisfaction. From outside the general store, barely audible over the sound of the crowd, Solomon made a single decisive noise that communicated his own position on the matter, and then returned to whatever he had been contemplating in the dust of the post. Wade made a sound that caused Hector Gaines, standing next to him, to step 2 inches to the left. Nora did not make any sound at all, but her eyes were bright, which was Nora's version of making a sound. Iris, who had been holding her drawing paper and her best pencil, because she had learned not to go anywhere without them, immediately looked for a surface to start drawing on, which was the most accurate expression of her feelings that she had access to. The weeks after that had a different texture than the weeks before. Not simpler, different. The practical shape of a life shared required the same attention to detail as the practical shape of a life spent surviving, and May had not expected it to require less, and it did not. The room addition to the cabin's east side required the attention to framing and weather sealing that Wade provided with the enthusiasm of someone applying new skills to a problem he had chosen rather than been assigned. Rope worked alongside him on the days his leg allowed it, which was most of them now, the injury finally conceding to the passage of time and the specific stubbornness of the man carrying it. She told him about the child on a March evening, sitting at the same table where she had opened the dismissal letter, with the lamp between them and the fire going and the sounds of Nora and Iris at the other end of the cabin, doing whatever they were doing, which appeared to involve a book and a spirited difference of opinion about its merits. She did not preface it. She said it directly, because she was a woman who valued precision, and because this was not a situation in which anything but precision was appropriate. He sat with it for a long moment, not a surprised moment, a moment of calibration, of a man placing new information into the structure of what he knew, and what he wanted and what he was prepared to do about both. The room, he said, needs to be done before October. I told you that 2 weeks ago. You told Wade. You implied it in my direction. You understood what I implied. I did. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the full weight of it this time, not the one careful second of the porch in November. October is manageable. She turned her hand over under his. I'm going to have opinions about how it's built. I assumed, and about the window placement. South-facing, for the morning light. He looked at their hands. I grew up in a house with north-facing windows. The rooms were always cold and the light was always wrong. A pause. South-facing. She looked at him. When did you decide that? Before you said anything. He met her eyes. I've been thinking about it since January. She understood that he had been planning for this before she had told him, which was either presumptuous or the specific kind of faith that looked like presumption from the outside and felt like something entirely different from the inside. She decided it was the second thing. She decided this easily, which was itself a new experience, deciding things about him easily. The south wall of the new room had 2 windows, which was more than Wade thought was necessary, and fewer than May wanted, and exactly what Rope said it should have, which turned out to be correct in terms of light and manageable in terms of heat retention, and she did not tell him he was right about this for approximately 3 days, and when she did tell him it was in passing, over breakfast, while reading something else, and he received it in the same manner, which was to say without ceremony or extended comment, and they continued breakfast. The summer came in the way Colorado summers came to the high valleys. Suddenly, and without apology, green filling in the brown of the winter range, with the aggressive efficiency of growing things that have a short season and know it. The kitchen garden went in, along the south-facing wall, as planned. Iris's drawings had moved from paper to the proper wooden boards. She had started to make herself with pieces from the lumber scraps of the room addition, cutting them and preparing the surface, with a patience that nobody had taught her, and which appeared to be simply the native patience of someone who had found the thing they were built for. Nora had been promoted to managing the full postal distribution for the Hatcher's Mill area. Mensquanji, which was a part-time position that Hatcher's Mill had not known it needed someone to manage until Nora had started managing it, and which paid enough that she had opened a small savings account at the bank in the next town east. She did not discuss this at the table. May found out about it from Harlow, who mentioned it in passiving during one of his periodic check-ins, and she found that the knowledge made her feel something she did not have an exact word for, something in the territory between pride and relief, and the particular satisfaction of watching a person build something solid. Wade had been given his own set of tongs by Hector Gaines on the occasion of completing his first independently crafted piece of ironwork, which was a set of hinges for a barn door that Gaines had inspected without comment and then told Wade to make a second pair because the first pair was good enough for practice. Wade had made the second pair, and Gaines had put them on the barn door without further comment, and the barn door had worked correctly, and that was the sum total of the ceremony. And Wade had described this entire sequence to the cabin table that evening, with the shining attention of a man who has received the highest honor of his experience and knows it. On a Thursday evening in late July, May was sitting on the porch in the last light of a day that had been warm enough to work outside without a coat, which was the specific pleasure of Colorado summer that made the winter seem, in retrospect, like something that had happened to someone else. Solomon was in the yard, which he had taken to doing in the evenings, wandering the perimeter of the cleared land in a slow circuit that appeared to have no purpose and served, She had come to understand the purpose of knowing exactly where everything was. Rope came out and sat beside her. Not in his old position against the wall, but in the second chair that had appeared on the porch at some point in the spring, without either of them making a decision about it. The way things appeared when people were sharing a space, rather than occupying it in shifts. They sat for a while without talking, which they had both always been capable of, but which had a different quality now than it had in November. The way the same color of sky looks different at different times of year. The valley below them was going from gold to gray in the unhurried sequence of a summer evening, and the peaks above them were holding the last of the light in the way mountains held it, at the edges first, and then in the middle, releasing the day from the top down. "I want to tell you something," May said. He waited. "When I was at St. Agnes, there was a period of about 2 years when I was the person who sat with people who were sick. Not officially. There was no official anything for people who were afraid in the night or running a fever in a winter when the heating was inadequate. She watched the valley. I did it because it needed doing. And also because I found that sitting with a person who needed sitting with was the only time I did not feel like the ground was unsteady. He was listening in the way he listened, which was completely. I have not felt unsteady ground since November," she said. "I want you to know that I know that, and I know what it is." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not the absence of a response, but the response itself, arranged in the form of a man sitting beside you in a chair that appeared on a porch without ceremony and looking at the valley in the last light. "I know what it is too," he said finally. "I knew what it was when I burned the paper." A pause. "I was not going to say so until you did." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because some things should be said in the right order." He met her gaze. "You spent 3 years saying things nobody wrote down. It seemed right to let you say this one first." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a mule stopping on a mountain trail in November, because a mule had decided something and was not prepared to be argued out of it. She thought about the specific faith required to follow an animal's certainty when your own was insufficient, and how that faith had delivered her to a door, and the door had opened, and behind it had been a man with a gray look in his eyes, and a dead woman's bonnet on his mantelpiece, and no intention of being redeemed that he was aware of yet. She thought about how the things worth having almost never announced themselves as worth having. They arrived in difficult weather. Barn, not palace. Porch, not ceremony. And she thought that this was not a lesser version of the life she had wanted. It was the accurate version. The version that corresponded to what was actually there, the way Iris drew the valley rather than the valley, as she wished it would be. Cold shadows and actual light, and the specific weight of a real place in a real season. "The ground is still good," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes." Behind them, through the window, the lamp came on, as Nora moved through the main room toward the kitchen, and the cabin window threw its familiar warm rectangle across the porch boards, and out into the yard where Solomon was finishing his circuit in the dusk, and the mountains above them received the last of the light from the west, and kept it in their upper reaches a little longer than the valley did, the way mountains always kept the light a little longer, and then let it go.